Lead Time is a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective, hosted by Tim Allman and Jack Caliberg. Lead Time taps into biblical wisdom for practical solutions to today's burning issues. Each podcast confronts real-time struggles facing the local church in a post-Christian culture. Step into the action with the ULC at uniteleadership.org. This is Lead Time.
Welcome to Lead Time. Tim Hallman here with Jack Caliberg. Today we are talking about a topic that will transform you as a leader. It's also a topic that you need to round back to consistently as a leader. It is all about systems theory. Now, Jack, when I started in ministry about 15 years ago, especially starting a ministry called The Table, I would not have survived apart from a lot of these concepts. And to be quite frank, I didn't understand the depth of family systems theory in my time at the seminary. I learned a lot of concepts. I learned about all these terms, how to balance law and gospel. I obviously learned about the two kinds of righteousness and a deep understanding and love for the scriptures. But there's also another side of the coin as a leader. As you enter into a community, how do you as a pastor, as just a leader and a human, enter into a church, a complex, interconnected web of relationships? There is no more messy place, Jack, than the local church. And I would say there's no greater place for health, a new way of being to thrive. But you have to understand your position within that respective system, that family system, which is the local church. So we've been reading a book called The Leader's Journey. And this is the second edition. It came out about 10 years ago, and they just redid it over COVID time, I think in 2020. Jim Harrington, Tricia Taylor, and Robert Creech, a collaborative work. And if you want to pick that up, please do so. But our 6 a.m. Study group has been going through this book, and we hit a chapter just yesterday, Jack, that we're like, whoa, we got to spend some time. We got to spend some time talking about this book. Now, I'm going to define some terms. And I'd love, this is kind of a way for you, Jack. How do you put these terms into your own words? Start off with 6 staples of a family systems theory. The first one is the togetherness forces. Talk just quickly in your own words about what a togetherness force looks like.
When I think in my own words of togetherness force, I think of when we hear kind of the traditional word chesed, connectedness.
Yeah.
So this idea that we kind of feel ourselves connected through relationship, like our relationships bind us together, that we're living life together, right? So these are just the things that are popping into my head.
That's great.
Of when I just hear that phrase, connected forces. So it's an emotional tie that people form with each other. Yeah. And we're finding identity in that. We're finding sometimes it's very kind of therapeutic to have friends that we can relate to, that we can have our stress, share our stresses with, get comfort from, encouragement from.
Yeah.
What do you have to add to that?
No, that's great. So you're talking about one side of the force or the pole, which is to be connected. And there's also this separate pole at the very same time, which is to be separate or disconnected. And healthy human relationships live both connected and differentiated at the very same time. So the second term is differentiation of self. What does that mean to you, Jack?
Yeah, so differentiation of self. When I hear that phrase, I come to understand the idea that whatever's going on in the system, that I'm both similar and unique to the other people that in the group that I'm with, right? So my gifts are different. My personality is different. My DNA is different. We're all created uniquely, but yet we're also created with a whole set of shared things that we have in common. Spiritually, we know we're all sinners. We're all justified. So there's a lot of things that unite us, but there's also things that are very different about us. And it can become very unhealthy if we start to fail to understand those differences that exist amongst people. You may even know this when you're thinking about parenting children. Your children are not identical, right?
It's true.
Even identical twins have some differentiation to them because they'll process things in a different way. So there's a difference, and we need to kind of respect that difference. And to be healthy, there's connection that we have to people, but there's also understanding our uniqueness.
Yep, absolutely.
Right.
And one of my favorite phrases, if I start to feel the psychological term is fused. If I start feeling too anxious when I enter into a room and I just feel everything and I've got to do something, I got to fix, and we're going to talk about some of these anxiety causes, my natural pull needs to be, as I grow in health, to become, hey, I'm just one person in the midst of this complex web of relationships. I'm not God. So I got to trust God and then us to solve, to grow, to become more whole.
And when that lack of differentiation isn't there, it can create some very unhealthy relationship dynamics. We'll be talking a little bit more later on as we kind of go through some of these more topics from this chapter. Yeah. But you could kind of even think of the most severe cases when somebody's going to get therapy, codependency, right? That's a very unhealthy form of different, where there is no differentiation that exists. Your whole existence is being expressed through your connection to another person.
Absolutely. The third staple of a systems theory is a triangle. Every human interaction depends on triangles. Now, there are healthy triangles, meaning I'm a leader of a team of two people, and I'm working with both of them. And if there is a problem, I'm inviting them to fix it together. And I recognize my place, and I will remove myself if I sense myself getting fused into that triangle. You've never been infused into triangles, have you, Jack? You have no experience with this, right?
Yeah, no, I've never experienced that. No, that's sarcasm here. I've probably experienced some extreme triangles, and honestly, I'm sure many people have in their lifetime, but you're not kidding when you said that getting into church work is probably one of the most challenging emotional environments to get into. Yep. And especially when you think about the church as a family, and you can think about how siblings will argue about a topic that they would never argue with just a casual friend with.
Right.
The emotional stakes get high. And so then sort of the unhealthy use of triangulation, right? It's not Bobby and Joe fighting with each other. It's Bobby plus mom going against Joe to try and amplify, and it becomes a tactic to try and win in a type of conflict. Now, like you said before, the triangle isn't necessarily dysfunctional in itself. But the power of the triangle can greatly amplify the problems that occur when there's anxiety and when there's conflict.
Let me give you an example of a triangle. You have at Christ Greenfield, where we're blessed to lead, you've got a number of different teams or departments. And maybe you're a smaller church leader and you still have teams of people, boards. It could be your evangelism board, board of elders, board of directors, whatever, a finance board. And triangles are created when the leader is trying to solve the anxiety, fix the problems of multiple groups. And these groups most often have different visions. This is silo ministry, right? You got all these respective silos, and they're speaking about one another, but they're not speaking about one another to one another. They're speaking about one another through the pastor. And that is a very vulnerable place to be, pastor. Get yourself out of that situation. And consistently, you've heard me talking this way recently with some of our team members. You must talk to one another. Do not talk about one another to your supervisor. Please talk to one another. We are one church, and we will resist dysfunctional triangles. Go ahead, Jack.
So since we're talking about triangles, let's talk about, I think there's an opportunity to talk about like a healthier response to triangles, because we're on the topic. So let's say group A, group B, they say, hey, we've got different visions for solving a problem in the church. Both are well-intentioned. But they feel very passionate, like this is the solution that needs to come forward. This is the solution that needs to win. So they both come to the pastor or the senior leader or the executive director and say, here's what needs to happen. Can you be on our side on this issue? And by default, if you're on our side, that means you're going to go get the other groups and you're going to put them in line. You're going to be our voice on our behalf, right? A healthier way, a way that more likely models the way Jesus would deal with triangles, is to stay in healthy connection with both groups, but to try and get these groups to talk with each other. And so the first thing is to get these groups to talk to each other, right? To avoid things getting into a conflict state. If let's say somebody in one department is not happy about how somebody is functioning in another department, the least healthiest way is that the director or the pastor or whatever is the one that's kind of forcing that fix to happen. The better way is getting them to talk to each other, right? The better way is let's set up a forum for communication. Maybe I can facilitate some discussion where we feel safe, right? Safe about sharing what our concerns are, that we also feel safe about receiving critique from people across departments. So creating an environment of emotional safety to give that feedback sideways rather than through the triangle. Much healthier way to go.
Amen. All right, let's keep going deeper here. So we got one, the togetherness forces, differentiation of self, triangles. I'm going to just summarize this one really quick. You must understand how peace changes a system. And when we talk peace in family systems, we're talking about moving from our amygdala, our reactive fight or flight reptilian brain, all the way up to our left prefrontal cortex. We are the only created beings, and I think it's one of the main indicators of being created in the image of God. We are able to, in the midst of chronically anxious situations, step in and provide peace. Now, Jesus is a Prince of Peace. He enters into the locked up room of your heart, your anxious heart, and he breathes peace. He gives you his Holy Spirit. You have everything you need because you have the Spirit of the living God living within you, breathing peace into you. So peace is very, very powerful. It's a powerful indicator, and leaders must be, and we're going to talk about anxiety here, it doesn't mean you don't have anxiety, but the most peace-filled people in the room. All right, then a fifth topic, Jack, is family of origin. You need to understand family of origin. We're not going to talk a lot about that here, but then where we're going to spend a lot of time is on the role of anxiety. There are
this is a big deal.
There are 4 actually standard behaviors in an anxious system. And if you got notes or just making some mental notes right now, this is a time to kind of get out that pen and paper. Here we go. There are 4 standard behaviors in an anxious system: conflict, distancing, over or under functioning, and then projection. Conflict, distancing, over or under functioning, or projection onto a third person. So the first one is conflict. Talk to us about conflict, Jack.
Conflict is when in our anxiety, we take on a form of all or nothing thinking. It's either all this way or all another way, and there's no middle ground, right? And so what happens when you have groups that both come to a discussion with all or nothing thinking? It is going to lead to conflict, right? So it's a lack of flexibility in how we think. We're kind of bypassing the part of us that allows to think about options that we didn't already have preconceived in our minds.
That's right.
Right. There are forms of prejudice that we have in here. I'm not talking about like, stereotyping people, but just kind of like just the way we think things should be, that we may hold on to those things so tightly that it causes all or nothing thinking. Where would you see like some examples of all or nothing thinking in the church, right? It might be related to orthodoxy, or it may be related to certain types of discipleship practices, or it might be who gets to use the kitchen on Saturday morning, right? It's all or nothing thinking. And sometimes you are in a situation where logistically, like you have to choose one thing over another. But do you want to default to that type of thinking, or do you just kind of have to deal with those situations as they come up?
Yeah, absolutely. So often we hear of the fight, flight, or freeze functionings. Those 3 F words are helpful right here. So obviously conflict is fighting. Here's a quote from the book. If we eliminate the conflict without dealing with the anxiety, that's the underlying cause that produces the conflict, the symptoms are sure to recycle themselves. And
it'll pop right back up.
Often leaders use power. We manipulate one another. This is the way it is. Just think of the home. Why are we doing it this way? Because I'm your father, because I'm your mother. So this is conflict. It doesn't fix the anxiety. It just recycles it eventually. The second one, standard behaviors, is distancing. So think of fighting as being too close. The togetherness forces your fuse. You can tick one another off with just a look or a respective tone. But the other pull is to distance or to flight, avoiding the pain of the conflict. Talk to us about distancing, Jack.
Yeah, well, and ironically, I would say I would prefer fighting over distancing because at least it's more evident of what's going on. When you have distancing going on, it can often be even more challenging to deal with the conflict that's underlying because nobody's talking about what needs to be talked about. Right. So yeah, the distancing happens when people fear the pain that comes with conflict. And so rather than going head into it, they're pulling apart and they're trying to figure out a way to coexist with people. Oftentimes they'll even be polite and cordial with each other. But what you'll see in that type of a system is that relationships are very cold. It's not a very inviting environment. Some people might even think, you see this a lot in denominational settings where there's maybe not been a lot of growth or a lot of innovation and people are just not happy with the status quo, but they're not sticking their head out. So they're just distancing and just saying, I'm just going to participate on the edges and just kind of let the system be the system. So yeah, a very cold environment, cordial, courteous, but the underlying issues don't get addressed. And that's the problem. So the underlying source of the anxiety, the actual anxiety, the source of the anxiety just gets prolonged for a very long time.
And relationships stay very shallow and superficial. I really believe, Jack, you know, the Holy Spirit put this desire on my heart to have the local church be the primary driver for organizational and institutional change within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And I think we have institutionalized passive-aggressive behavior. Here's one of the quotes that I when I read this, I was like, this is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Superficial relationships keep conflict to a minimum, but they do not make the anxiety disappear. A congregation, and I would say a denomination or group of congregations in which people refuse to interact at more than a superficial level is an anxious system. So you do you, I'm going to do me. We know there are problems, and you could list a whole host of problems, fighting about worship style or discipleship methods, leadership development methods. We know there are problems, but I don't really want to talk about it. I don't really want to get in the room or on the call with a person that has a different view. So you do you, I'm going to do me. And the group continues to pull. And what we end up, what we end up doing, Jack, is creating a parody about the other person or the other group that is not even anywhere close to how it actually is.
Well, and let's think about that even more when we think about distancing. And now, but we still have triangles forming. Now, what do we have? As more and more distance happens, now you've got the creation of silos.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Now I've got this clique that feels this way, this clique that feels this way about it, and they're starting to coalesce, and they kind of acknowledge the existence of the other group, but they don't see themselves as part of that group. Now you've got almost sort of formal silos that are forming in that type of system.
So what changes?
Which can later on turn into major conflict as that distancing is happening and people start, doing some of the other behaviors that we see, then it can come back and it can become a big conflict as you've created almost armies of people that are ready to go fight. But in the meantime, it's distancing, right?
And this is the only ticket for this, whether you're talking a denomination or a church, the only ticket for transformation is a healthy leader who steps into the diverse siloed groups and says, I see what you're doing here. I know you. I know your values. I care about a lot of the things that you care about. And at the very same time, I know this other group, a lot of their values. And then they find areas of overlap and unity. And then you can still keep within these different groups. You recognize the strengths of each group. We need to listen to one another. And I'll just say in the conversation around worship in particular, like I need a slower, more historically minded, though I love history, and kind of speaking in just general terms here, brother or sister who love the 500 years history of the Lutheran liturgy and our time. I need that person here. At the very same time, this person needs someone who's watching the world, understanding the way music and worship and the heart language of today. And we can keep some things the same while at the very same time saying, it's going to feel a little bit different. The values are different. And I just don't see, unfortunately, in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, a lot of leaders like embracing that space.
Well, and that's a good point, Tim. We've talked before about the innovation and orthodoxy pendulum that exists, and how you don't want to be unhealthily balanced towards one side of the pendulum or not. Actually, a really healthy church could own the entire part of the pendulum.
That's right.
But that requires incredible emotional maturity, is I think what we're realizing from this discussion here. You have to be self-aware, and you have to be able to handle the type of anxiety that may exist on both sides of that spectrum.
Yep, absolutely. So you have standard behaviors, conflict, distancing, the fight or the flight, pull. Two other characteristics in a anxious system is over or under functioning. So one part of the system focuses on one group or person who does not seem to be doing well. You could call that person the underfunctioner. And then another part of the system works hard to make up for the underfunctioner. This is called the overfunctioner or the overfunctioning team. Any words about over and underfunctioning, Jack?
Well, here's probably an easy way to observe it, maybe even in a small group. Do you have a person that dominates conversation, and you have people that withdraw from conversation? And when they withdraw, does that cause the person who dominates to dominate even more?
That's
right? Because I can't handle the silence. So that's almost kind of like the psychology that you could think about with the over and underperformer, that the overperformer sees a gap and says, well, I'm just going to step in and do this since other people aren't doing it. And what that does is it's kind of a short-term solution to the issue, but for the overperformer, it's causing them to take on an unhealthy responsibility in the system. For the underperformer, it's giving them permission to not take on the responsibility that they need to have.
Absolutely.
So in self-awareness, a person kind of is aware of themselves, either over or underperforming, and can also speak into others and try to be intentional about calling out over or underperformance, saying, hey, this is not your responsibility to take on these things. This should be a shared responsibility for other people. Now, Tim, I'm just thinking about this as we're having this conversation. Probably one of the most common examples of over and underperforming has to do with church governance. Thoughts on that?
Well, it could go either way. It depends on the governance model for sure. I mean, in some churches, the governance model, I'm thinking of some smaller churches today, the governance model is like a lot of people on the board, like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do. I think I'm supposed to hold the pastor accountable, but he seems to have a respective vision. So they kind of pull off and they don't create any kind of policies or boundaries.
Which causes him to overfunction.
Overfunction, exactly. And then in some other
opposite can happen.
The opposite is a passive pastor who's in this system. And think of the church of about 100 and 150 people, and you have a number of power brokers who have overfunctioned for a long period of time. And they, I think a lot of it is subconscious. They subconsciously keep that pastor in his role. You just do word and sacrament. We got the vision. We own the ministry.
Stick to your lane.
Stick to your lane. You're not the leader here. They may not say that, but that's in all intents by not giving clarity for his role and responsibility within the ministry. They keep him in an underperforming role. I would say, gosh, Jack, the average size church today who knows how many they're worshiping right now, but 80 to 100 people on a respective Sunday. I'll ask you the question. Which of those imbalances do you think is more common in a church?
I'm seeing both kinds. And we've done this through our consultation already with small churches. I've seen them healthy, where there's healthy relationships. And in those healthy relationships, you see both a board and a pastor with this great united vision of what the future looks like. I've seen imbalance where pastors want to own vision and they want to take responsibility, but there is a fear from the board that they're going to snap that back, and so they won't take risks. So that, to me, is an indication of a board overfunctioning. And then I've seen other instances where it's basically like just the pastor with leadership and you have a board that just kind of comes together and meets because they have to tick the box that they had a meeting.
Yeah.
I would guess in the very, very small churches that's probably the most common type. And that it may cycle up and down. Like if the board thinks that things are good, then they're going to try and immediately try to underfunction. But if they think things are bad, then they're going to try and immediately overfunction. That's kind of my guess of how it would play out.
I think that's pretty close. I was kind of going 50-50. It kind of depends. And a lot of it depends on the pastor's perspective as he enters into that system. If he's a little bit more aggressive, we're going to see, I think, a board sitting back and kind of saying, okay, we've been waiting for you. But then on the other hand, I think more of our pastors, and this is based on our research in the Harrison Behavioral Assessment, they're mostly passive. And so I think more power brokers, lay leaders have kind of raised up to overfunction. So the fourth...
especially if you think that like that board may tend to elect like business leaders and stuff like that, entrepreneurs, to the extent that that's how they think about electing leadership, I think you would definitely see that type of dynamic play out.
Absolutely. And so the fourth way that standard behavior for a anxious system is projection onto a third person. We can do this one really, really quick. Projection of anxiety on one problem person. It's the pastor. The pastor has to go, or that leader
or
of
the
that
associate
team,
pastor.
they're the problem, or that associate needs to
or the youth
get
director. Right?
So we simplify. See, because systems are always very complex and interconnected, web of relationships. We simplify to try to bring peace to an anxious system by projecting blame onto one person, a third party. A scapegoat. It never works.
No.
It never works. All right, let's get super practical here. The characteristics of an anxious system. There's a heightened level of reactivity. We've talked about this. Many people are taking things far too seriously. They're getting triggered, and this often causes an organization to organize around the least mature leader. It's crazy how a system often does this. They organize around the least mature leader. Now, they may seem right up front as the most gregarious, inspiring, they got energy getting out there. Charisma, but look behind the shadow side. There's often a shadow side about why that person wants to be in that positional leadership role, and it may not be a healthy reason. So talk about organizations organizing around the least mature leader.
So the heightened level of reactivity causes us to bypass the thinking part of our brain, and we start making emotional decisions tied towards trying to avoid the pain, right? That's coming in. We want easy solutions. And so when we start to think about how can we avoid pain, it becomes very attractive for when a leader comes up and says, I've got an easy solution, right? Now, if somebody comes up and says, I've got an easy solution, that's probably a sign that person is the least qualified leader, because solutions are rarely painless. Solutions to big problems are rarely painless. They do require a lot of honesty, a lot of gut checks, a lot of grit, right, to kind of get through things, a lot of hard decisions. And when somebody is offering leadership that is void of all that, like for the thinking person, that should be a sign like, oh, maybe this person is offering something that's not what we need right now.
I think what they may be saying, Jack, is I got a solution. And I'm the solution. just let me come in. What you're missing is me. Yeah. So
now I'm gonna, without throwing anybody under the bus, I'm gonna share a little bit about my experience in leadership. This is under an old governance model, and we had at the time a school board. And I will talk about the sort of the heightened level of reactivity that existed there. The school at that time, this is a long time ago, like a decade ago or plus. And there's a lot of financial stress. And so there's a lot of worry about financial stress at that board, which had that responsibility of dealing with the issue. It wasn't technically the staff's responsibility. It was this board's responsibility that met once a month. And so they're trying to figure out in a once a month meeting, how to fix all of the financial problems of the school. And that led to some very reactive decision making, because we needed to find something easy. And the easy decisions were not the right decisions. The right decisions were actually like hard, difficult, gritty decisions to to kind of create sustained changes.
And it was about relationship, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the difficulty was returning toward a peaceful, understanding, united place of relationship between leaders. Can you say just a bit more about a bad decision that was made in kind of angst because it was easy?
Yeah. So the gritty decision was they needed to increase tuition. And because the board was staffed entirely by parents, it's very difficult for parents to vote to increase their tuition.
Right.
Now, the thinking part of it can recognize that, but the emotional part that also has a personal budget doesn't want to deal with that difficulty. So somebody came forward and said, "I've got another way," and that other way was let's give scholarships and discounts to everybody across the board, and that'll boost enrollment. But the problem is that they were already losing money at the level that they had, and so that extended to everybody that was already enrolled in the school, and it just made the margins even worse. It just put it more into the red. It didn't actually boost enrollment at all. It actually was a discouragement for enrollment because now they have less of a budget to improve the quality of the program.
I'm not going to get into politics here, but it kind of seems like the spending plan, it could be Republican or Democrat. Hey, we got a big problem with a huge deficit. Yeah. Let's spend more money.
Let's spend more money to fix the deficit.
Right? That's going to help inflation, isn't it? All right, I could go on, but we're just going to keep
and both parties are guilty of that. So
both parties, that's exactly right. All right, let's the herding instinct. This is something that I think is gold. In an anxious system where pressure exists, there's going to be a herd mentality. Now, what do you have in a herd mentality?
Circle the wagons.
Circle the wagon. So here's my favorite quote. Feelings become more important to the group than ideas. The system consistently chooses peace over progress. This is what happens in a herding mentality. Peace over progress, comfort over experimentation, and the security of the port. Now we're using the image of the open seas here. The security of the port over the adventure of the open seas. Black and white, all or nothing thinking marks that system. Thoughts on that, Jack?
And we just spoke earlier about what is the source of conflict. The source of conflict is all or nothing thinking, right? So in this type of system, now you have a majority or a super majority of people that have said this is the way to do it. And we've created now fear and suspicion and maybe some narcissism and xenophobia about people that think differently about some of the topics that we've created orthodoxy around, right? So how do we deal with that? Do we have an open, honest conversation about that? Do we take on all or nothing thinking about it? And so I would say, honestly, this is what our denomination is looking like right now.
Right. We were at I guess I was at our district convention and heard from our synodical president and speaking very, I think, not pointedly to kind of the things we're about, but kind of around it, not with clarity around what Kairos and the Luther House of Studies and competency-based theological education is, but kind of hearing a number of these things. And then he made a statement, which I respectfully do not agree with, saying if we explore any other models for theological formation, we will kill the seminaries. It's like, that's a bold statement about the future. He must be some kind of futurist, you know what I'm saying? To like fully understand what the future would be if you try another model. We choose to say
that is a very bold statement.
It's a very bold statement, and I just frankly disagree.
There's no data to support that decision, and we've even in our research kind of proven the theories from real world examples that absolutely does not have to be the case. And in fact, it could be completely the opposite.
That's right.
We're kind of having other models combined with the residential program could actually create flourishing for both programs.
Yeah, it could give you numerous models on that side. But anyway, we just don't live when a herd mentality exists. There is a leader or a leadership team, and I just want to find myself as one of the herd. I'm not going to test a whole lot of things. And so whatever the leader says and does, I will kind of receive. I find safety and protection in that way. And a vicious cycle starts. Increased anxiety produces increased reactivity, which leads to increased hurting, resulting in increased anxiety, and on the vicious cycle goes. All right, just a couple more points. We're coming down the home stretch. Go ahead, Jack.
Just real quick, though. So you're circling the wagons. And so what you've done now is that you've limited your influence only to what happens inside that wagon train.
Yeah, that's right.
You have no influence now outside that wagon train, whereas the wagon train that's moving forward along the path, they get to exert influence on everything that's around it. The group that circles up only gets to influence what's within, and it can only survive to the extent that what is in that circle is healthy. But if it becomes unhealthy, right, you have a very limited ability now to bring in new resources that are necessary to bring health to that system. That's very sad.
Yeah, and you may even justify your decline as a congregation, denomination, organization, whatever, through blame displacement. It's those guys' problem. This is the Adam and Eve syndrome. It's that woman you gave me. So finding a simple place to place blame, finger pointing, leading toward a quick fix. Anxious systems often go after a quick fix, Jack. They focus on eliminating the symptoms rather than on dealing with the underlying emotional processes, keeping those negative, dysfunctional systems alive. And the anxious system actually needs the dysfunction. It thrives on the dysfunction rather than creative solutions to lead toward health.
Because if the dysfunction wasn't there, it wouldn't be anxious, right? So, and if that's what if let's say if you got a mode of thinking now, that's kind of like your primary mode of thinking. The moment that you have a reason to not be anxious, you actually start looking for reasons to become anxious.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And that's something, right?
Unless there is anxiety, the leader a lot of times, what is my purpose?
Right.
What is my
fix
role
the anxiety
now? Yeah, because up to this
but never
point
gets fixed.
It's been and the last symptom of a really anxious system is poor leadership.
Yeah.
No vision. Here's a universal truth. Anxious families, churches, businesses always lack a vision for the future. If a vision for a preferred future is set, that means we're going to have to figure out how we're messed up right now. We're going to have to get healthy. We're going to have to work together. We're going to have to own that shared future together. And then we're going to stay connected to one another as we move forward, as we build, measure, learn, try new things. But poor leadership is kind of the staple in an anxious system. Any last points on that, Jack?
One of the things I want to commend many of the lay leaders for the church that we're at, Christ Greenfield, this is going back a long time ago, is that it had itself in a conflicted, anxious type of environment where there was a lot of silos. And everybody, no matter what side of the aisle you were on, everybody can agree that there was unhealthy silos. And so I want to give a lot of props to the lay leaders that kind of led in that time that said, the one thing that we don't want to have here anymore is silos. That's the one thing that we're not going to tolerate anymore. And when we start looking for new leadership and casting a new vision, that new vision was a siloless vision for the ministry. And I want to give a lot of props for having the emotional awareness to see that and to make that a priority for the decisions that kind of led to where we're at right now in a much healthier system.
Absolutely. So the healthy leader learns to hold their sense of personal vision and principles despite the resistance and pressure within the relationship system. And then this is the key. They stay in relationship with those they lead without having to control them or enter into the intensity of the emotional process. They resist being triangulated. So again, it's going back to the staple of a systems theory. They are able to stay connected in love, but also differentiated as they cast vision for a preferred future, the Holy Spirit leading the way. So the last thing we're going to close with is toward the back of the book. It's a hidden gem in the leader's journey. They talk about the transformational learning model. And if you're looking online, I'm just going to show you what this looks like. It looks like an upward kind of tornado starting at the ground level. And right at the base level, it says information. And then right next to that is practice and then reflection. more information, practice, and then reflection, and on you go. So if you've taken this podcast and you're like, man, I got more to learn, go read The Leader's Journey. Pick up the book by Edwin Friedman, who's really the godfather in secular family systems theory. And his main kind of magnum opus book is called The Failure of Nerve. The Failure of Nerve. All of these topics, Edwin goes into deep discussion. If you're looking for, hey, who's written something about the healthy church and the healthy pastor, look up Peter Steinke, Pete Steinke, Steinke. Pete was a LCMS boy growing up, but then ended up growing into one of the most prolific family systems theory consultants for churches. And he passed away a couple years ago. And I was blessed about a decade ago, as I was entering into ministry, to have my doctorate of ministry. The first class that I was in, Jack, was with Pete Steinke. Wow. So the transformational learning model, it says there's a balance between content and then craft or practice, and then character development in community. So again, the Kairos model of learning says it's not just about content. It's not just about credits and classes. It's also about practice, doing the ministry. And then in the doing of it, we're going to test one of the characteristics. How well do you receive? How humble are you to receive feedback? Is the fruit of the Spirit being shown in your life? So it's a balance between content, character, and craft. That's the transformational learning model.
And how well you handle a triangulated situation. I mean, that's something that I think as a person, as a leader, is growing. This is a great opportunity for the new leader to reflect on that with a more senior leader that may have more experience on that, because you're going to have it. You're going to find yourself in a situation where you've got Joe versus Sally or whoever it is, and they've got conflict between themselves, and they're looking for you to provide the answer on that. And every single one of those opportunities is going to be a learning opportunity for you to figure out how to handle detriangulation in a more effective, care, compassionate, direct way. And you can kind of see it as a learning experience. You may not deal with the first one very well, but the second time may be a better time. The third time you may do even better than that as you become more aware, self-aware, more emotionally mature. And that's kind of like an example of putting that in place.
Churches could do, I'm going to give one tip for a church leader. Read this book with your team. At the end of every chapter, there's a lot of really good questions for application. And if you happen to be listening and are an LCMS leader, maybe at our seminaries or universities, make sure that a family systems theory class is mandatory for all of your leaders. It should be like one of the first classes that a leader takes, because all of this, doing ministry, is a messy thing. It means you're going to be in environments where there's going to be conflict. And how do you handle yourself in the midst of it as a differentiated and connected leader? That was a lot of fun, Jack. Thank you for this time. Hey, sharing is caring. Get the word out about Lead Time. Every single week, we have a brand new episode coming out. This is a good one. If you happen to be a business leader, share it with a friend. Have good conversations, because everything we said about the church is true in your organization as well. Absolutely. Thanks for joining us today on Lead Time. We'll see you next week.
God bless.
You've been listening to Lead Time, a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective. The ULC consults and brings together cohorts of congregations to build the culture, systems, and structures of intentional discipleship multiplication. To go deeper with us, create a free login on uniteleadership.org for access to exclusive materials and resources. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for next week's episode.